Introduction: The Art of Defying Odds. The Persian soldiers who survived Thermopylae spoke of it in whispers. 300 Spartans and their allies standing against the might of an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean. It was suicide, of course. And yet those whispers carried a deeper terror. For 3 days, the impossible had seemed possible. History's greatest battles are not measured merely in casualties or conquered territories. They are measured in moments when the very laws of probability seem to bend, when the weight of empire, technology, and overwhelming numbers crash against the stubborn wall of human ingenuity and courage, only to fall back broken. This is a book about those moments. It is about Alexander, barely more than a boy, who saw in the endless ranks of the Persian army not an insurmountable wall, but a puzzle to be solved. About Admiral Yi, who turned 13 ships into an unconquerable fleet through his mastery of tide and terrain. About a handful of RAF pilots who, between their morning tea and evening whiskey, rewrote the rules of modern warfare while the fate of civilization hung in the balance. These are not just tales of victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. They are masterclasses in the art of the impossible moments when commanders and soldiers alike faced the cold mathematics of certain defeat and refused to accept its conclusions. Their stories, separated by centuries and continents, share a common thread: the revelation that impossible odds are often just a failure of imagination. In the pages that follow, we will walk the blood-soaked fields of Cannae, stand atop Vienna's walls as the largest cavalry charge in history unfolds, and soar through the skies above Britain as a nation fights for its very survival. Through their eyes, we will learn that the greatest battles are won not just with swords and bullets, but with the unconquerable power of the human spirit. These are the battles that remind us. Sometimes the most important part of making history is refusing to accept its predicted course. Chapter 1. The day a boy king shattered an empire. Dawn broke over the plains of Gaugamela with the weight of destiny. To the east, the first rays of sunlight caught the bronze tips of Persian spears, countless points of fire stretching to the horizon. To the west stood Alexander's men, their throats dry, watching their young king pace before their lines. They had marched 1,000 miles for this moment. Behind enemy lines, deep in the heart of Persian territory, they faced an army that outnumbered them at least 5-1. Darius III, great king of Persia, had personally chosen this battlefield, a vast plain meticulously leveled to accommodate his scythe-wheeled chariots. The morning air rang with the sound of those wheels being tested, the screech of metal against stone promising a harvest of Greek flesh. But Alexander saw something different in the pre-dawn gloom. Where others saw an ocean of Persian forces ready to engulf them, the 25-year-old king saw gaps and seams, weaknesses that existed not in spite of the Persian army's size, but because of it. An army so vast required coordination. Coordination required predictability. And predictability to Alexander was an opportunity. His plan was either madness or genius, perhaps both. As his officers gathered for final instructions, Alexander's intense grey eyes sparked with an almost feverish light. "Gentlemen," he said, "today we're not just fighting for Greece. We're fighting for the right to be remembered." The Persian advance began like an avalanche. Darius had positioned his best cavalry on the flanks, with his deadly chariots forming the spearhead. The earth trembled under the advance of the largest army ever assembled in human history. Alexander's response appeared to be retreat, a fighting withdrawal that drew the Persian right wing further and further from their center. What happened next would be studied by military commanders for the next 2,000 years. As the Persian line stretched to maintain cohesion, Alexander spotted his moment. Wheeling his elite companion cavalry in a tight arc, he drove straight for the gap that had opened near Darius's position. The Persian arrows fell like rain, but the Macedonian cavalry formed their famous wedge formation, the point of a spear aimed at the heart of an empire. The Persian center buckled. Darius, seeing the Macedonian cavalry breakthrough, made a fateful decision. Perhaps remembering his narrow escape at Issus 2 years earlier, he turned his chariot and fled. The sight of the great king's departure rippled through the Persian ranks like a poison. But the battle was far from over. Cut off from the main army, Alexander's cavalry found themselves surrounded by Persian forces who refused to yield. It was here, in what historians would later call the hammer and anvil, that Alexander proved himself more than just a tactical genius. Fighting alongside his men, his white-plumed helmet visible as a rallying point, he demonstrated why his troops would follow him to the ends of the earth. The remaining Persian forces fought with desperate courage, but their formation had been fatally compromised. As the sun reached its zenith, the greatest empire the world had ever known began to disintegrate, not from the edges, but from its very heart. By nightfall, Alexander stood in Darius's abandoned tent, looking over the Persian king's personal items with a mixture of contempt and fascination. The golden breadbasket, the jewel-encrusted cosmetic boxes, all the trappings of empire lay scattered about him. But his mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't just a victory, it was a beginning. The Battle of Gaugamela marked more than the effective end of the Persian Empire. It demonstrated that the impossible was negotiable. A force of 47,000 had routed an army of 250,000 through a combination of innovation, timing, and sheer audacity. Alexander had proved that victory belongs not to the side with the most spears, but to those who dare to imagine new ways of using them. In the years that followed, Alexander would push the boundaries of the known world, creating an empire that stretched from Greece to India. But it was here, on the plains of Gaugamela, that he earned his title, the Great, not just through victory, but through the artistry with which he achieved it. The lesson of Gaugamela echoes through the centuries. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to achieving the impossible is the belief that it is impossible. Chapter 2. The Perfect Tactical Battle. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BCE, the Roman legions mustered with absolute confidence. The dusty plains of Cannae stretched before them, the summer heat already shimmering above the parched earth. 8 legions strong, the largest army Rome had ever fielded, they represented the mightiest military machine of the ancient world. Their target, a ragged army of mercenaries led by a one-eyed Carthaginian general who had spent far too long raiding the Italian countryside. Hannibal Barca stood on a small rise, studying the Roman deployment through his remaining eye. Behind him, his men ate their morning meal in silence. They were a motley crew: Numidian horsemen, Spanish infantry, Gallic warriors, and his corps of Carthaginian veterans. Many had followed him across the Alps 3 years earlier. Those who survived now watched their commander with absolute trust, despite being outnumbered nearly 2-1. What the Romans saw as Hannibal's weakness, his smaller force, his desperate position deep in enemy territory, he had transformed into weapons. His men were lean, hungry, and bound together by years of shared hardship. The Romans, by contrast, were led by 2 consuls who could barely agree on the time of day. As the Roman army advanced, their steps synchronized like a massive machine. Hannibal's thin lips curved into a smile. The trap he had spent years preparing was about to snap shut. The Roman consuls had packed their infantry unusually deep, creating a formation like a battering ram. They planned to smash through Hannibal's center through sheer mass. It was exactly what Hannibal had anticipated. His own center, comprised of Gallic and Spanish infantry, was arranged in an unusual convex arc, bulging toward the Romans. The battle began with a clash of cavalry on both flanks. Here, Hannibal had positioned his supreme asset, the Numidian horsemen, masters of the hit-and-run tactics that had frustrated Rome for years. But today they did something unexpected. Instead of their usual harassment, they pressed hard into the Roman cavalry, driving them from the field entirely. The Roman infantry, seeing the cavalry retreat, pressed harder into Hannibal's center. The Gauls and Spaniards fell back, not in panic, but in carefully orchestrated steps. The Roman formation, sensing victory, surged forward. Thousands of sandaled feet kicked up clouds of dust that obscured their vision. They didn't see their formation stretching, elongating, creating gaps in their once perfect lines. That's when Hannibal's veterans, hidden on the wings, struck. The elite Carthaginian troops wheeled inward like the gates of hell swinging shut. The Roman legions, packed so tightly they could barely lift their swords, found themselves encircled. The dusty plain had become a kill box. What followed was not a battle, but a methodical annihilation. The Roman army, over 80,000 strong, was systematically destroyed in what military historians would later call the perfect tactical battle. By day's end, the field of Cannae had become a testament to Hannibal's genius and Rome's darkest hour. The cream of Roman society, senators, knights, and nobles who served as officers, lay dead among their men. A messenger reached Rome the next day. The city fell into mourning so deep that the temples were closed. The gods themselves seemed to have abandoned Rome. The historian Livy would later write that no other nation could have suffered such a catastrophe and survived. But perhaps Hannibal's perfect victory contained the seeds of his ultimate failure. He had demonstrated that the impossible was possible, that Rome's legions could be not just defeated but destroyed. In doing so, he taught Rome a lesson it would never forget. The empire that emerged from the trauma of Cannae was harder, more resilient, and utterly unwilling to accept defeat. Years later, when Roman children played at war in the streets of the Eternal City, they would still argue over who got to play Hannibal. His name had become synonymous with military genius, his victory at Cannae the gold standard against which all battles were measured. He had achieved tactical perfection, a battle so complete, so devastating that it would be studied for the next 2,000 years. But on that August evening, as Hannibal walked the bloody field of his greatest triumph, he might have already sensed the truth. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do to an empire is convince it that it's mortal. Chapter 3. The Tactical Genius of Admiral Yi Sun-sin. The morning tide rushed through the Myeongyang Strait like a river of fury. Admiral Yi Sun-sin stood at the helm of his flagship, watching the swirling waters below. After a lifetime of naval warfare, he had chosen this battlefield, a narrow strip of sea between Jindo and the Korean mainland, for its treacherous currents. Today, those waters would either save Korea or witness its final defeat. Behind him lay his entire fleet, 12 battered warships. Before him, emerging from the morning mist like a floating city, came the Japanese invasion force, 133 heavy warships, packed with the veterans of 100 victories. The Japanese admiral, Todo Takatora, had expected to find the strait undefended. The sight of Yi's tiny fleet actually waiting for battle made him laugh. Yi had every reason to flee. His once mighty fleet lay mostly destroyed, the result of a corrupt rival's schemes and false accusations that had briefly landed him in prison. But Yi understood something his enemies did not. Naval warfare wasn't about counting ships, it was about controlling the sea itself. The Myeongyang Strait held a secret. Every day, its tides shifted with clockwork precision, creating whirlpools capable of swallowing small boats whole. Yi had spent weeks studying these patterns, learning their rhythms. Now, as the Japanese fleet approached, he positioned his ships in a precise formation, using the strait's narrowest point to negate the enemy's numerical advantage. Todo's fleet advanced with the confidence of predators. Their ships were larger, their guns more numerous, their samurai crews undefeated. The first Japanese vessels entered the strait at full sail, eager to overwhelm Yi's pitiful force through sheer mass. That's when the tide turned, literally. Yi had timed his stand perfectly. As the Japanese ships crowded into the strait, the incoming tide slammed against the outgoing current. Massive whirlpools formed, grabbing Japanese ships and spinning them like toys. Their tight formation, intended for overwhelming force, became a liability. Ships crashed into each other, snapping oars and tangling rigging. Yi's flagship, the legendary Turtle Ship, led the Korean counterattack. Its dragonhead cannon roared to life, spewing flame into the chaos. His 12 other ships moved with practiced precision, their crews firing in disciplined volleys. Every shot counted. Every maneuver was executed with the precision of a surgeon's knife. The Japanese tried to retreat, but the current had other ideas. Their ships, too numerous and densely packed, created a floating traffic jam. Those in the rear continued to push forward, unaware of the disaster unfolding ahead. Those in the front could neither advance nor retreat. Yi's voice carried across the water, steady and clear. "Do not fire unless you can hit. Each arrow must kill." His archers waited for the perfect moment when the whirlpools would expose the enemy ship's vulnerabilities. The result was devastating. Japanese sailors, famous for their discipline, began jumping overboard, preferring the mercy of the currents to Yi's methodical destruction. By midday, the sea ran red. Todo's mighty fleet had been shattered. 31 Japanese ships lay at the bottom of the strait. Not a single Korean vessel was lost. Yi had turned the greatest naval battle in Korean history into a masterclass of tactical genius. But numbers tell only part of the story. Yi's victory at Myeongyang wasn't just about ships and strategy, it was about vision. Where others saw insurmountable odds, he saw the hidden power of the sea itself. Where others counted ships, he counted currents and tides. He had turned nature into his ally and mathematics into an art form. The battle's impact resonated far beyond that autumn day in 1597. Yi had not just saved his country, he had demonstrated that true naval power came not from the size of one's fleet, but from understanding the very nature of the sea itself. His 13 ships had changed the course of naval warfare forever. In Korean naval academies today, students still study the tide charts of Myeongyang. They learn that victory doesn't always go to the strongest fleet, but to the commander who best understands that the sea itself is the greatest warrior of all. Admiral Yi would fight many more battles before his death in combat a year later. But it was here, in the swirling waters of Myeongyang, that he proved an eternal truth. Nature plays no favorites, but she will always side with those who truly understand her power. Chapter 4. The Arrival of the Winged Hussars, a turning point in history. Vienna, September 11, 1683. The morning air carried the stench of gunpowder and desperation. For 2 months, the city's walls had withstood the Ottoman Empire's mightiest siege engines. Now those ancient stones were crumbling. Turkish sappers had dug tunnels beneath the Lobel bastion, packing them with gunpowder. It was only a matter of time before Vienna's heart was torn open. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa paced his luxurious tent, already fantasizing about his triumphant entry into the fallen city. His army of 140,000 men had reduced Europe's mightiest fortress to its last loaf of bread. The city's capture would open the continent's soft underbelly to Ottoman expansion. Paris and Rome would be next. What Mustafa didn't know was that high in the Kahlenberg Hills, overlooking his siege lines, a miracle was assembling in the pre-dawn darkness. King John III. Sobieski of Poland had forced-marched his army 500 miles in 4 weeks to reach this moment. Now he sat astride his warhorse, surveying the Ottoman camps below. Beside him, the elite of European Christendom, German princes, Austrian nobles, Saxon knights waited for his command. But the real power of his army lay in the 3,000 Polish heavy cavalry behind him, the legendary Winged Hussars. Their very appearance was designed to inspire terror. Steel breastplates gleamed in the early light. From each rider's back rose the wooden frames that gave them their name, supporting eagle feathers that created an otherworldly screech at full gallop. These were the finest cavalry in Europe, about to attempt the largest cavalry charge in human history. The battle began with an artillery bombardment that caught the Ottomans completely by surprise. As Turkish commanders scrambled to reposition their forces, Sobieski unveiled his masterstroke. While infantry engaged the Ottoman lines directly, he led his cavalry in a wide arc, seeking the perfect ground for a charge. At 5:30 p.m., the moment arrived. Sobieski raised his saber, and the signal rippled down the line. 3,000 Hussars lowered their 20-foot lances. The ground began to tremble. What happened next became legend. The combined weight of horses, men, and armor, nearly 100 tons of steel and flesh, hit the Ottoman lines at full gallop. The sound was apocalyptic. The screech of wings, the thunder of hooves, the screams of the dying all merged into a symphony of destruction. The Ottoman line didn't just break, it shattered. Elite Janissary units, the backbone of the Turkish army, found themselves helpless against this avalanche of steel. The charge's momentum carried the Hussars straight through the enemy formation and into the siege camps beyond. Mustafa, watching his army collapse, ordered a general retreat. In their haste to escape, the Ottomans abandoned their entire siege train, including the holy standard of the Prophet Muhammad, a blow to Islamic pride that would resonate for centuries. By sunset, the largest Ottoman army ever assembled lay in ruins. Vienna's surviving defenders emerged from their walls to find the countryside littered with abandoned tents, weapons, and the world's largest collection of coffee beans, inadvertently launching Vienna's famous cafe culture. But the battle's significance transcended its immediate outcome. The Ottoman Empire, which had expanded for 3 centuries, had finally met its limit. Never again would a Muslim army threaten the heart of Europe. The continent's political center of gravity shifted, setting the stage for the rise of new powers and the gradual decline of others. Sobieski, in a letter to his wife, wrote simply, "I came, I saw, God conquered." He understood that he had participated in something beyond mere military victory. The charge of the winged Hussars had become one of history's hinge points, a moment when the impossible became possible through the perfect combination of desperation, courage, and tactical genius. Today, visitors to Vienna can still trace the outline of the old walls. Few realize they're walking on ground where civilization itself pivoted on the outcome of a single desperate cavalry charge. But perhaps that's the nature of pivotal moments. They're only recognized as such after the thunder of hooves has faded into legend. Chapter 5. The Battle of Britain, a testament to innovation and courage. Summer 1940. Europe had fallen. Hitler's Wehrmacht had swept through France with surgical precision, leaving Britain alone against the Nazi war machine. In underground bunkers beneath London streets, RAF Fighter Command tracked incoming German raiders on a massive plotting table, pushing wooden markers across a grid with long poles, like some desperate game of chess played for the highest stakes imaginable. The numbers told a story of certain defeat. The Luftwaffe had 2,600 aircraft poised across the Channel. Britain could muster barely 700 fighters to defend its skies. The German pilots were battle-hardened veterans of the Blitzkrieg. Many RAF pilots were barely out of flight school, some with less than 15 hours in their Spitfires and Hurricanes. But Britain had 2 secrets that would change the course of aerial warfare forever: radar and Keith Park. Air Vice Marshal Park, a quiet New Zealander with a rugby player's build, had designed an air defense system that transformed Britain's numerical weakness into an unexpected strength. Radar stations along the coast provided early warning of German attacks. Park's pilots could remain on the ground until the last possible moment, scrambling only when needed, preserving precious fuel and energy. The first phase of the battle began with attacks on shipping and coastal installations. The Germans expected to easily overwhelm the RAF. Instead, they found themselves in a deadly game of 3-dimensional chess. Park would dispatch just enough fighters to disrupt each raid, never committing his entire force, always keeping a reserve. August 13th marked the beginning of Adlertag, Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe's all-out effort to destroy the RAF on the ground. The sky over southern England became a swirling arena of dogfights. German bombers flew through clouds of exploding flak, while Messerschmitt Bf 109S tangled with Spitfires in lethal aerial ballets. The German pilots called their British counterparts the Few, at first mockingly, then with growing respect. What they couldn't understand was how these seemingly inexperienced pilots always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Radar remained Britain's secret weapon, invisible but decisive. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, commanding 85 Squadron, captured the surreal nature of the battle in his diary. One moment you're drinking tea at the dispersal hut, the next you're at 20,000 feet with your guns blazing. Then back for more tea, while the ground crew count the bullet holes and patch them up. It's like a deadly game of tennis, played in 3 dimensions with live ammunition. The battle reached its crescendo on September 15th. The Luftwaffe launched its largest raid yet, nearly 1,500 aircraft aimed at London. Park System faced its ultimate test. The sky over London became a cauldron of combat. The Germans lost 56 aircraft that day. The RAF lost 28 planes, but most importantly, 20 of their pilots survived to fight again. The mathematical reality of attrition began to favor the defenders. Britain could replace aircraft faster than Germany. More crucially, thanks to Park's defensive system, British pilots who were shot down often parachuted safely over friendly territory, returning to their squadrons within hours. German pilots who went down became prisoners of war. Hitler, faced with mounting losses and the approaching Russian winter, postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The RAF had achieved the impossible. They had fought the world's most powerful air force to a standstill. But the battle's significance extended far beyond Britain's survival. It marked the first time in history that an air force, fighting alone, had decided the fate of a nation. The RAF's victory demonstrated that control of the air was not just about numbers of aircraft or skill of pilots. It was about systems, technology, and the integration of intelligence with operations. The lessons learned over southern England would shape aerial warfare for generations. The battle proved that a smaller force, properly organized and equipped, could defeat a numerically superior enemy through better tactics and technology. Today, in the RAF Club in London, there's a simple leather-bound book containing the names of the few, the pilots who saved Britain. Many were barely old enough to vote. Some came from as far as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and New Zealand. Together, they proved that the impossible becomes possible when desperation meets innovation, when courage meets technology, and when a handful of young pilots refuse to accept the mathematical certainty of defeat. The art of achieving the impossible. History's greatest victories share an invisible architecture. From the dusty plains of Gaugamela to the storm-tossed waters of Myeongnyang, from the skies over London to the walls of Vienna, certain elements emerge that transform the impossible into the inevitable. The first is the recognition that numbers are not destiny. Alexander didn't try to match Darius's 1,000,000 men. Admiral Yi didn't attempt to build 100 ships. Instead, they understood that warfare, like physics, operates on leverage points, places where a small force, perfectly applied, can move mountains. The second is the mastery of terrain, not just its physical features, but its hidden dimensions. Hannibal's genius at Cannae wasn't just his tactical brilliance, but his understanding of human psychology. He knew exactly how Roman pride would respond to his apparent weakness. The RAF's victory relied not just on radar, but on the invisible architecture of radio waves and command systems that turned Britain's entire island into an integrated defensive weapon. But perhaps the most crucial element is the least tangible, the ability to see possibility where others see only doom. When Jan Sobieski looked down from the Kahlenberg Heights, he didn't see an impregnable Ottoman army. He saw the perfect ground for a cavalry charge that would shake the foundations of empire. These battles changed more than military history. They altered our understanding of human potential. Alexander's victory showed that empires could be toppled by innovation. Hannibal proved that invincibility was an illusion. Yi demonstrated that nature itself could be turned into an ally. The winged Hussars revealed how a single perfectly timed action could alter the course of civilization. The RAF proved that technology, properly applied, could level any playing field. Modern warfare has changed beyond recognition. Drones circle battlefields where once cavalry charged, Artificial intelligence analyzes terrain that commanders once surveyed from horseback. Yet the fundamental principles demonstrated by these victories remain startlingly relevant. Today's impossible odds wear different faces: climate change, pandemic diseases, technological disruption. But perhaps these ancient victories still have something to teach us. They remind us that humanity's greatest achievements often come not from overwhelming force, but from the innovative application of limited resources. They show us that understanding the true nature of a challenge, its hidden patterns and underlying physics, matters more than raw power. Most importantly, they teach us that the word impossible is often just a failure of imagination. Alexander didn't accept the conventional wisdom about Persian invincibility. Yi refused to believe that 13 ships couldn't defeat 100. The RAF's young pilots never accepted that Britain stood alone. These battles, separated by centuries and continents, form a masterclass in the art of the impossible. They remind us that history's greatest victories often come not from the size of one's army, but from the boldness of one's vision. They teach us that when courage meets preparation, when innovation meets opportunity, the impossible becomes merely difficult, and the difficult becomes destiny. Perhaps that's their greatest legacy. In an age facing its own impossible challenges, these ancient victories remind us that the future belongs not to those with the most resources, but to those who dare to reimagine what's possible. After all, every great achievement in human history began with someone looking at insurmountable odds and saying, perhaps, if we try it this way,